Hey guys, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History. I hope that you all had a nice break. We are continuing on with our Unit 2 lectures on the revival in Europe. So what's been happening in Europe? We've talked about Africa, Asia, the Middle East, China. Let's talk about Europe. So this is going to be aligning with topic 2.6 in the course description. For your bell work, I want you to think back, who is Ibn Battuta and why is he significant? So, urban and rural revival. I know I got those flipped. So this aligns with topic 2.6 in the AP course curriculum. The environmental consequences of connectivity. So our objective for today is that you will be able to explain the environmental effects of various networks of exchange in Afro-Eurasia. Are you ready? So when we talk about Western Europe, we are really talking about sort of this idea of the Latin West. This is to differentiate Western Europe from Eastern Europe. Why do we want to do that? Well, for a few reasons. Western Europe, when we say Western Europe, when we refer to the Latin West, we are talking about the part of Europe that is Roman Catholic as opposed to Eastern Orthodox. So that means which part of Europe was not under the control or significant cultural influence of the Byzantine Empire. And then later, the Latin West will remain independent, whereas, Kievan Rus will be conquered by the Mongols, Constantinople will be conquered by the Ottomans. So you still have this significant part of Europe, which is Christian, and in this case, specifically Roman Catholic. We use the term Latin because Latin was the language of the elites. Now, you wouldn't have people talking in Latin, chit-chatting, but every church service was in Latin. The Bible was written in Latin. If you were writing a letter to someone, there's a decent chance you're writing it in Latin. All books, anything academic or intellectual would be written in Latin. That was key. That was a mark of education. So, what's been going on? Well, most people, of course, are not educated, not writing in Latin. Most people are serfs. They're living on large estates, and these large estates are owned by a lord, right? This is thinking back to what we learned about last unit with manorialism and feudalism. So we are returning to this economic system. So most people are serfs. That means they owe the lord who owns their land a share of their harvest. The idea is that the lord, of course, would protect them, but as time goes on and you see the disappearance of the Vikings and the growth of these sort of nations, you see really meager returns for hard work. These peasants are working their behinds off all day, every day, and really they're not being raided by the Vikings anymore. So you see lots of rural poverty. And in part, one of the reasons why we have this rural poverty is because of rapid population growth. So why do we have this population growth? Well, we see it is the result of technological advances. And then, of course, environmental influences. So, let's talk about the environment first, and then I'm going to talk about the three-field system. Between the period sort of 800 to 1300, you have this medieval warm period, this time when the Earth's temperatures were warmer, leading to a couple things. Leading to increased growing seasons, larger yield from crops, leading to more food supply and thus more population. Now, around 1500, we will see or 1500, a really dramatic drop in the temperature. Now, why is this happening, right? Why did we have this time period of extreme warmth and then this time period of extreme cooling, the Little Ice Age? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. Meteorologists, of course, can go into a lot of depth, but here is one theory that I found really fascinating. It comes from the book 1491 by Christopher Mann, which is an excellent read if you want to learn about pre-Columbian America. And what he proposes is that the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples in the Americas, were not sort of passively living on the land. There is this European idea of the noble savage, and the noble savage essentially is like one with the land and nature and all this stuff. Well, that removes a lot of agency from Native peoples. We have lots of evidence in the archaeological record showing how indigenous peoples in the Americas were dramatically changing the environment, just like peoples in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And one of the ways we see this was through the use of slash and burn. Remember when we talked about the Americas, we talked about how dense the jungle was and how difficult it is to live in the jungle and how there's snakes and gangrene and it's just a mess. Well, what do you do then to get more agricultural land? You need to clear the jungle. How do you do that when you don't have a chainsaw? Well, you use fire. So Christopher Mann's theory is this. We saw such massive rates of slash and burn agriculture in the Americas, in the rainforest, that the ash from this action is going to actually cause some global warming. So it's because of the environmental change being wrought on the land by the indigenous peoples in the Americas that we see lots of ash and pollution going up into the atmosphere, causing global warming, causing this medieval warm period. Okay, what happens around 1500? The Spanish and Portuguese arrive in the Americas and start spreading smallpox and completely disrupt the population of the Americas, causing like 80 million people to die. So of course, you're no longer going to have massive deforestation because you are increasing your agricultural capacity because you're trying to stay alive because you have smallpox. So this is fascinating, totally connects with our AP theme, right, of interactions with the environment and how what's happening in the Americas is still impacting Europe and vice versa, right? I think it's easy to think about people living in complete isolation in this time period, but they don't. So you have this warm period, which allows for increased crop production. You also have some new technological advances like a mold board, like mold like you'd see on bread, but in this case, think about some things like molded together. So a mold board is a curved iron plate, which would allow for the soil to be turned over on a deeper level. So you would use this when you plow your fields. You would see the use of crop rotation, which allows the land to be uncultivated for part of the year to restore the soil. But this means your productivity is going to be a lot lower. So how can you work around that? Well, you might use the 3-field system. The 3-field system is a rotational system that means you have 2 fields in use at any one time. And the 3rd field is sitting in fallow and restoring its nutrition and productivity. So the nutrients and the nitrogen would replenish in the soil during its year off, and then you'd rotate. You also have the emergence of things like the new horse collars, allowing horses to pull more weight, and stirrups. That was a huge deal that comes from the Mongols. So agricultural improvements leads to increased production, leads to population growth, leads to the increase in size of urban areas. So you see changes in the natural environment in Europe as well. More swamps are drained. It's during this time you really start to see all of Europe's old growth forests being cleared away. Some peasants will gain some financial freedom with these agricultural advances and will move to the cities. They'll be able to buy their way out of their serfdom and move to the cities. But of course, all this will change with the Black Death. So, when the temperatures drop in the 14th, 15th century, or 14th century, we will see the growth of plagues. Why? Well, you have this surplus population, right? You have all of these extra people who move to the cities, who are now living in a higher density area, and all of a sudden food production is dropping and a new disease is, on the prowl. So the Black Death, also known as the Bubonic Plague, is going to arrive in Europe in the mid-14th century. So that's the 1300s. About 2/3 of Europeans will die. In some places, 1/3 in other places, meaning about 50% of Europe's population would die. Can you imagine that? Imagine 15% of UHS dying from a plague. Actually, you know what? If there was ever a year to be able to understand the impact of a pandemic on a community, I think this is the year that you guys can actually understand what a huge impact this would have. Think about the ways that the coronavirus has disrupted the supply chain, how it has disrupted normal work life, normal school life, food production, how you spend your money, how your family makes their money. Now imagine a disease that is significantly deadlier, that you don't know how it is spreading, you also don't know how to stop it, and you have no technological advances to allow for life to go on while you stay isolated. It's dramatic. So it will, of course, reverse all of our population growth. It begins in China. We see a lot of diseases emerging out of Asia because there's a higher population growth, and as viruses mutate and spread from person to person, it makes sense that's going to come from a place that has a lot of people. So, victims of the bubonic plague will first develop boils. Think like a giant blister, right? A boil, about the size of eggs on your groin and in your armpits. Then you'll get black blotches on your skin as your skin starts to rot. Then your body starts to rot more, so you smell terrible, foul body odors, and you're in extreme pain throughout this whole thing, right? So you die in a few days. So how do you do this, right? How do you address this if you are a government institution and you have no idea about germs yet, right? Germs aren't even going to become a thing until, like 1900, basically. That's when germ theory will start to be commonly understood. Well, cities will close off areas with infected people. They'll burn all of the victims' possessions because they don't really know. Like, oh gosh, if you are sick, I don't want to be sick. I'm just going to completely quarantine you. Of course, this means people who aren't sick will be abandoned. You hear stories from primary sources of children crying behind locked doors because they've been locked in with the rest of their dead family, and they have no way of feeding themselves or getting free, and they're scared and they're hungry, but you can't risk these people having, these kids having the disease, and so they're just left to die even if they weren't sick yet. So after the plague starts to spread, you start to see huge changes. Historians generally tend to think that the disease started in Genoa, or arrived in Europe via trade ships in Genoa, right? So this whole unit is about trade and the impact of trade and how these places interact with each other. many people are going to believe that this disease is God's divine punishment for earthly sins. Right? It's, you might think, oh, that's so silly, but it does sort of feel like the world is ending in a lot of ways. I mean, look around, you see disease, you see forest fires, you see hurricanes, you see people angry at each other in politics, communities being broken up. And it does kind of feel like, oh gosh, are we being punished for something? So imagine in a much more religious world, of course you would feel like God was punishing you. So some people are going to be like, great, if we want to stop the disease, we need to make God happy. How do we do that? Well, there must be heretics, right? There must be people who are displeasing God, and we need to get rid of those people. So one of the things we see that is across Europe, Jews will be persecuted and killed by the thousands because they weren't Christian. Again, the Jewish population in a variety of regions will often be targeted throughout history because of the way the Jewish community lives apart from the broader community, whether that's in the Middle East or in Europe, right? We've talked about the unique features of Jewish life, how you are to marry other Jews, you eat differently, you bathe differently, you live your life a little bit differently, and this is going to always set them apart from the larger population. And when things go south and you're looking for a scapegoat, it's often the Jews who are targeted. So we see Jews are murdered. We see that some people believe that, okay, if I want to stop the disease, I need to be more pious. I need to be a better Christian. So sometimes that means I'm just going to pray more. Some people are going to go crazy and start giving away all their money. They're going to start, it's called self-flagellation. Basically, you take a whip with an iron tip on the end of it, and you walk around from city to city and shirtless and just a loincloth, barefoot, whipping yourself with this thing. And so the iron tip would rip into your back, and so you'd be bleeding, and this is you're trying to mirror Christ's suffering. You're trying to show how pious you are. Some people took the point of view of, well, we're all going to die, so I might as well go down partying. And you hear from primary sources stories of people getting drunk, doing medieval drugs, having orgies. Again, you see that the rich are going to be able to survive in some higher numbers because they have homes in the countryside. So they are able to just up and leave the cities and isolate themselves in the countryside. So if you've ever read the book, The Decameron, it's a piece of medieval literature. You might have to read it for one of your classes in college someday, or it has been used by the AP before as a primary source. The Decameron is a bunch of stories of Italy during the plague, and part of the point of view as people are telling these stories to each other is they're living in isolation in a villa, in Tuscany. The population in Europe will not recover to pre-plague levels until 1500. So it'll take over a century for Europe's population to fully recover. So there are 3 videos I want you to watch. One of them is historical. 2 of them are silly. So I want you to watch the TED Ed one on the Black Death so you learn some stuff about the Black Death. I want you to watch this silly one. The song Hollaback Girl might be a little before your time, but it was, this is a very silly song, and it will be stuck in your head, and you're welcome. You don't have to watch the entire thing. I usually show about a minute and a half of it. And then, of course, this tends to be what we think of. So Bring Out Your Dead from Monty Python, sort of the attitudes towards the dead. Again, very silly, not required, but it makes me laugh. Okay, so you have this huge population boom. You have a lot of rural poverty. You have people in cities dying. You have frustration and you don't know why everyone's dying. And what do? Well, just like you see social unrest today in the United States and around the world as a result of the coronavirus, you see social unrest in Europe. Serfdom was a coerced labor system developed after the fall of Rome. But because of the population drop of the Black Death, you are going to see that serfdom is no longer really useful. You have too few workers, and those workers are going to get organized. So you are going to see peasant revolts as they fight back against the rich who are able to sort of isolate themselves and stay protected. Basically, the Black Death is going to be the end of serfdom and the end of the feudal system in Europe. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process, but the Black Death is the turning point. Skilled and manual laborers begin to demand higher pay, and they can because there's less competition. When authorities would resist this higher pay, peasants would just rise up against them. So the jacquerie is a widespread revolt in France where peasants will kill dozens of nobility and loot castles in 1381. Peasants will invade London in England. And at the end of the day, authorities are always able to put down these revolts with a lot of violence. However, this change is happening everywhere. Since there is such a demand for labor and the lords don't have a way to really keep their peasants in one place, serfs are just going to run away and find a job elsewhere and say, like, I'm free. What do you mean? Yeah, I don't belong to any lord. So we start to see as well, because of population shortage, a need for technological innovation to make up the difference. So we start to see an increase in industry because of this population shortage, and some of this industry would be things like water wheels. So you would use the water wheel to generate power, and then you'd use this power to do things like grind grain. So instead of like using your hands, it would turn two large stones together, and you put the wheat in between there and you get flour on the other side. It would be used to saw logs, to crush olives, to tan leather, to make paper. So water wheels were originally used by the Romans, but that information was lost, and it's going to be rediscovered because it's also being used in the Islamic world. Mills will allow for the expansion of iron production, thus leading to an increase in mining and a building boom, thus leading to an increase in quarrying. So you would get stone from a quarry, thus leading to more pollution. So you see a lot of pollution in canals from runoff of mining and increased deforestation. So how did the inhabitants of the Latin West, rich and poor, rural and urban, how do they deal with their natural environment? And remember, disease is part of this natural environment as well. Okay, so if we saw cities decline because of the Black Death, we are also going to see them revive. So you have the second half of the medieval period, the High Middle Ages. So the first half is like Black Death, feudalism, violence, sort of the Dark Ages. The second half is going to be the High Middle Ages, where you're going to have like the Renaissance, or Renaissance is going to come afterwards, but you're going to have increased agricultural output, increased education and urbanization, economic trade and banking, and the strengthening of nation states. So what does this mean? Well, we see new technology is going to lead to increased economic output and agriculture. We're going to see the decline of manorialism and feudalism. We're going to see the emergence of our first universities, like in Montpellier, France, and in London. We see increased social mobility because of the increased trade and banking. And with the declining number of smaller feudal structures, meaning lords who might not own a lot of land, but they do have a lot of influence, we see stronger centralized monarchies. Like I said, the Viking raids have ended. So, part of this strengthening of nation states, you're going to see some massive wars, like the 100 Years' War between France and Britain, and thus new warfare technology. So we see trading cities growing as well. We've talked about the Silk Roads, we've talked about Indian Ocean trade, we've talked about trans-Saharan trade. You also have a lot of trade happening in Europe, of course. And the trade is happening between these major cities. So in Italy, you have these trading city-states that are really dominant. Venice, Genoa, and Florence are the three powerhouses there. You also have a trade network sort of known as the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe. Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges. So, in the Fourth Crusade, remember, Venice is going to raid Constantinople. So you see the picture on the slide, those horses? Yeah, the Crusaders stole that from Constantinople. You see that Marco Polo is going to come from Venice. So the most urbanized part of the Western world is going to be Italy, with these Italian city-states, which makes sense, right? Prior to the Dark Ages, Italy was the most urbanized part of the Western world as well. You have these urban structures left from Rome that have just been built upon. So one of the reasons why we see the Renaissance emerging out of Italy is because of the wealth centered here from trade. Merchants want to show off how rich they are, and so they are going to commission artists to create these masterpieces that are, yes, beautiful, but also frivolous, right? What a great way to say I'm super rich is I can waste a lot of money on a statue, right? You have to use all your money to like feed your children, whatever. I have enough money to feed my children and buy pretty art. Venice and Genoa will really grow wealthy because of trade during the Crusades, and in part because of advances in shipbuilding technology. This means they can carry more cargo and sail all year round. The florin, which is the gold coin, the currency of Florence, will become standard currency in most major trading centers in Europe. And it's really important to understand this is really an elite movement, right? Renaissance and all this. Most people in Europe are still peasants, and they are not trading florins. We see that skilled workers begin to form into guilds. So a guild is kind of like a union in some ways. A guild is an organization that grouped people in the same business or trade in a single city. So you would have like the blacksmiths guild, the merchants guild, the bankers guild, the weavers guild, sculptors, artists. We see guilds present in medieval Europe, but also in the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. The benefit of a guild is that they will give workers financial security. It helps protect markets. They will set prices, and so you're not going to undercut each other. I mean, part of what a guild does is sort of create a monopoly over an industry. All blacksmiths in Florence will charge this amount to shoe a horse. All weavers in Venice will charge this much to make a tapestry. And it's not like you can go to a competitor and get a better deal. They all basically charge the same thing. It ensured standards. You couldn't be part of the guild unless your goods were up to snuff. And if you weren't part of the guild, well, why would anyone not buy from you? Your goods clearly suck. And it will regulate apprenticeships. So how do you get started in these industries? Well, probably around your age, as maybe high school, 14 and up, you might be apprenticed in a guild. That means you would move in with a master and you would start working and you'd learn the trade. And it means when you grow up, you would have a job, a really good job that was guaranteed pay. And one of the other things guilds would do is if, let's say, you got injured, the guild would help support your family still. But it would also mean they could deny access into these industries to outsiders, to women, to Jews. And this is going to help develop sort of these skilled industries in Europe. We also see the growth in trade and banking, right? So the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, they are going to specialize in trade goods. So like wool will come from England. France will produce wine and cheese. Scandinavia, so think Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Timber, fur. Money begins to replace the bartering system, and banking and insurance systems emerge. So the Medici family will operate out of Florence running banking. And in Northern Europe, you have the Hanseatic League, which is a confederation of merchant guilds in cities in Northwestern Europe. Don't worry too much about the Hanseatic League. It's not going to show up on your exam. Just know it as an example of a trade network in Northern Europe. That's the main thing to focus on for the Hanseatic League. All right, this is an optional one. It's useful, though, to understand the dynamic of trade in Europe. Describe some of the economic and technological changes in the High Middle Ages. All right, let's talk a little bit about civic life in the High Middle Ages. Well, we see that as populations start to recover, more and more people are moving to cities. This means large cities will grow, but also smaller towns will grow as well as people leave sort of serfdom and move to more urban centers. Literacy will really expand in the large urban centers, and there's a new emphasis on education in general. So in the 11th century, only cathedral schools would educate people, and you'd really just be educating boys so then they could become priests eventually, right? Who else would need to know how to learn? By the 13th century, you have universities that are training students in theology, in law, in medicine. You have academic learning for academic sake, right? This is definitely a reflection of the influence of the Crusades, the returning of Greek philosophy and the learning coming out of Baghdad and Samarkand. The result will be increased economic and cultural vitality in Europe after the 11th century. Most Jews in Europe are living in cities. Now, in part, this is because the Jewish populations were not allowed to purchase land. European communities would not allow Jews to become farmers, so they are really regulated to cities. They would also often work in manufacturing and in banking because they would be kept out of agriculture as well. Commercial cities would often welcome them because of the manufacturing and banking and business skills that they could provide. And of all of Europe, Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, had the largest populations of Jews. And in part, it's because, if you remember, Spain was being governed by the Cordoban Caliphate, right? It was under Muslim rule, and Muslim rule was very tolerant towards people of the book, right? Jews and Christians. Jews would have to endure violent persecution and expulsions in times of crisis like the Black Death, And in 1492, when you have the Reconquista, Isabella and Ferdinand retake Spain, you will see all of the Jews expelled from Spain. Really, the only place in Europe where they're welcomed is Rome, because the Pope is going to welcome them. All right, what about women? Well, once again, this is still super patriarchal society. Women's traditional roles are still being emphasized as wife and childcare provider. But again, this really depends on your social class, right? If you're a peasant woman, you don't have the luxury to sit at home and just take care of the babies and embroider. No, you're out there in the fields, you're working beside your husband. If you are a peasant, even like a industrial woman, you're working beside your husband in business. It's really only elite, very, very small portion of the population in which women sort of live very, how do I want to say this, inactive lives. So remember, we still have the code of chivalry being enforced here, and it's this idea that like women are weak and delicate and subordinate, so they need to be protected. Remember, in medieval Europe, noble women were really used more as pawns than as independent players. So many women, elite women, might choose to become a nun because it gives you some agency in your life apart from marriage. So you have two opposing attitudes towards women. On one hand, you have the veneration of Mary and female saints, right? So very Catholic during this time. And so you're looking towards, the perfect woman, Mary, mother of Jesus. And these female significant religious figures give women honor and power and prestige. But the flip side is, during this time, you start to see an emphasis on Eve as the source of sin. This is something that emerges particularly in Roman Catholic tradition during the medieval period. I think it's important when you're talking about Christian theology, understanding which are ideas that are in place from the beginning and are universally accepted, and which are going to emerge out of specific cultural contexts and be attached to particular traditions. So the fact that the Roman Catholic Church only allows, male leadership, the fact that they are only, the men are not allowed to be married even, right? It makes sense when they also fully emphasize that like Eve was the source of sin in the world, the source of the fall. Whereas traditional Christian theology places the blame equally on Adam and Eve. Women didn't have any property rights, but could trade, and some guilds would allow some women. It's more like you could join the guild with your husband kind of thing. All right, we'll talk a lot more about art, but like you have cathedrals being built during this time. They're big and they're pretty. You start to see the emergence of some secular literature like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or Beowulf. But we'll talk a lot more about art next lesson with the Renaissance. And I encourage you to take AP Art History if you want to learn more about cathedrals. Okay, so what social and economic factors led to the growth of cities in late medieval Europe? Great. Let's talk a little bit about political and military transformations to finish up our day. So, we start to see the rise of nation states, of monarchies, as feudalism disappears. All right, we've already talked about the Magna Carta, how it was designed to give nobles some power over the king. And yet we still see that monarchs are growing in power and in influence. So out of the High Middle Ages, you have a new understanding of nobility. It's less focused on the military and warfare and more focused on court life. So rural-based nobility will be attracted to the wealth of cities and marry into wealthy merchant families, right? So if you own a lot of land, but you might not have a lot of wealth, you might marry your son to that rich merchant's daughter, and thus giving honor and prestige to her family and getting a lot of money yourself as with her dowry. You start to see nobles pursuing education to maintain government offices, and you end up with new social standards of conduct, meaning you should be able to dance these dances, you need to speak these languages, you need to be graceful and courteous. It's a new secular model as opposed to a religious model for individual behavior. And you end up with highly ritualized etiquette for court life. So what's the 100 Years' War? Well, the 100 Years' War is really France and Britain go to war for 100 years. It's a series of campaigns over control of the throne of France involving English and French royal families. It's complex. For world history, you don't really need to know more than like it happened. If you're taking AP European history, obviously you need to know a lot more depth. But for our purposes, it happened. A couple things will emerge out of the 100 Years' War. One, new weapons. The crossbow, and then eventually firearms will emerge. You'll have the use of bowmen, pikemen. You can sort of see them in this image here with their large bows, and pikes are kind of like spears with hooks on them. You start to see musketeers and artillerymen. This is a big change from the warfare of the early Middle Ages when you had like knights on horses in armor. You have Joan of Arc. During this time period, she rallies the French troops, defeats the English in a battle, and then is captured by the English and burned as a witch. But in general, out of all of this ongoing conflict between France and England, you start to see the emergence of new monarchies, of centralized states with fixed national boundaries and stronger institutions. So if you're constantly at war, you need to maintain a large army. Okay, how do you pay for a large army? You start to increase taxes on nobility, and you start to increase taxes on merchants. Well, then people in both of those groups might want to demand some representation in government. So you see in England the emergence of Parliament with the House of Lords and House of Commons. In France, you have the emergence of the Estates General. Henry V is one of the major kings at this time period. And of course, there is the Shakespeare play, Henry V. This is not required, but it's a beautiful monologue. Soliloquy? I don't know my English terms. It's a beautiful speech out of the play Henry V, performed by Kenneth Branagh in the movie Henry V. It's a great movie. It's a great play. Great speech. Not required, but I would recommend you watch it. It's a few minutes long. It's a beautiful speech. It sort of gives you a visual for what we're talking about here with like increased power of kings and all that jazz. All right, what about in Spain? Well, I read the most fascinating book recently on Isabella. And one of the things that really becomes clear to me out of this book is how smart she was and how dumb Ferdinand was. Ferdinand was basically a waste of space. The Iberian Peninsula for a long time had been contested territory between Christians and Muslims. So constantly you have these noble families fighting with the Muslim powers. It would go back, centuries. Just you're getting a little bit more land, you're losing land. Well, after 1400, Queen Isabella of Castile, right? Castile and Aragon are two smaller kingdoms in Spain. Spain was not unified at this time. You had a lot of smaller kingdoms. So, right? You see Leon, Aragon, Castile, I think like Portugal doing its own thing. Isabella will marry Ferdinand. Both are extremely devout. Isabella is an extremely devout Christian Catholic woman. She's also really smart and practical. Ferdinand mostly likes to drink and fight, but she has to cut a deal with him at some point because it's not like they have a harmonious marriage. And part of that deal includes them signing a document as like Ferdinand and Isabella, and it means he gets credit for basically all of her hard work and history because his name comes first on a document. But she helps organize the Reconquista. So the Reconquista is the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and it will be successful by 1492. One of the things we're going to see is that with this, the Muslim presence will really be pushed out of Spain. You will also see a very strong military and a very strong connection to the church. Now, one of the things you have here is religious uniformity. It's designed to create unity and bolster royal power, but it means Jews and Muslims are really going to be expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, and many will go to Rome. You start to see the Inquisition. Again, this isn't something that's really organized from the church. It's from the crown, but it's certainly not stopped by the crown. The Inquisition, the torture, persecution of possible heretics. Why? Well, it's a way to go after opposition. You can profit because the crown and the church would take possession of all the wealth of the people who were heretics. It will also mean that Spain is in a position of like extreme nationalism and expansion. So when a dude named Columbus shows up in Madrid and is like, I want to go and find a new route to China because, screw the Ottomans. Isabella is like, yes, absolutely. I want access to this wealth, and I hate the Ottomans because they destroyed Constantinople. Also, they might conquer us at any time by sailing across the Mediterranean. This was a huge fear. And thus, you have the discovery of the Americas in 1492. Okay. What social, political, and military developments contributed to the rise of European nations during this time period? Let's do a few practice questions. Source-based. Pause it here so you can read your source. Using the excerpts as evidence, which of the following is a correct conclusion regarding the people's views of the plague at the time? What conclusion about the Black Death could be drawn from the excerpts? Which of the following was a direct result of the Black Death? So, please explain the environmental effects of the various networks of exchange in Afro-Eurasia from 1200 to 1450. So think specifically, how did the environment affect Europe? European trade, European society, demographics, all that jazz. Interactions with the environment. Okay, I know this was a long one. Thanks for listening, guys.